The next part I want to go over is the motherboard. The motherboard is what's going to connect all of the components inside of your computer, so you can make sure they're compatible. The first thing to check is the CPU. The CPU and the motherboard will both have a socket type, and you need to make sure these match so you can use that CPU with that motherboard. The next thing to go over is memory. You make sure the double data rate type matches the double data rate type of your motherboard. Your memory and your motherboard must match, or they will not even be able to properly be inserted in the DIMM slots. Your motherboard also has a maximum amount of memory that it can support, so you need to make sure you use the same amount or less than that maximum amount. You also need to make sure that the frequency of your memory is supported on the motherboard. The next thing to go over are storage drives. You need to make sure that you have an M.2 slot on your motherboard if you plan to use an M.2 drive. Other than that, you need to make sure you have the right amount of SATA slots, that way you can use all the drives that you plan to use. The next thing to check is the power supply. The power supply needs the same connectors that your motherboard needs. That being, the power supply must have a 24 pin if your motherboard uses a 24 pin, and must have an 8 pin if your motherboard uses an 8 pin. There are also 4 pin and 20 pin that your power supply will need if your motherboard uses those connectors. The next thing to go over is the video card. The video card needs to be slotted in a PCI Express x16 slot. You'll want to make sure that your motherboard has one, that way you can use that video card. The final thing to go over is your case. The case I/O will need to have the I/O connectors on the motherboard. If the motherboard does not have that I/O connector, you will not be able to use that input on the case. You'll also want to make sure the motherboard has the features that you want. This comes in the form of a chipset and any onboard items. First, for the chipset is what determines the software features that your motherboard has, specifically in the BIOS or UEFI. This is important for overclockers, as you'll want to make sure that your motherboard will support overclocking. In terms of onboard items, if you need Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, you'll want to make sure that comes included on the motherboard, or if it doesn't, you'll want to make sure you'll have enough room on the PCI slots so that you can add an expansion card later.